Yeah, I would also like to thank, first of all, the organizers of this conference. They have been extremely hospitable to us already yesterday over the whole day. It's extremely well organized, and thank you very much for having us here. Maybe before I start, just a small word on my connection to Heidegger. Actually, delivering critiques for Robert Alexy is kind of my hobbies, and my real occupation right now, my theoretical interest, is in legal hermeneutics. And what I try to do is to develop an analytical reconstruction of legal hermeneutics. And there Heidegger plays an important role because I think in the development of hermeneutics, by turning hermeneutics existential, he had a very important role to play, which then plays out in Gadamer's work. And Gadamer is one of my reference points who I try to analytically reconstruct. So there's quite a connection. I was surprised myself that I ended up in Freiburg and doing this hermeneutical stuff, but it fits very well to the genius loci. So, but for today, totally different topic. There's a long-standing debate between Professor Alexy and me, or rather between me and Professor Alexy, which I started some 15 years ago with a chapter in my habilitation. And we have run through different rounds, and today is round 3 of this exchange. And but however, before I want to go into the thick of things, I would like to make 3 preliminary points. The first is that I want to assure you that there's nothing personal in this critique. I've always been a huge fan of Robert Alexy's work. As a student, I've admired his book on legal argumentation, which had made a big impression on me, not only in its substance, but also in its interdisciplinary outreach, in its analytical clarity. He reintroduced an analytical style into the German legal debate, which otherwise is often clustered with rhetorical fanfare and strong opinionating, but very less rigorous analytical work. And Robert Alexy's work was and still is an inspiration for those who seek a rigorous pursuit of academic knowledge. And moreover, sometimes his summaries of my critiques are analytically even more precise than my original argument. So even though I disagree sharply with him in substance, he is still one of my heroes in German legal theory. The second point I want to make is that I want to tell you what our disagreement is not about, and what is not the aim of my critique. And third, I want to give you a brief recap of the rounds 1 and 2, since I would neither suspect nor advise anyone without a special knack for idiosyncratic legal theoretical debates to be in the know. Only when the stage is set in this way, there is room for round 3. And here we'll try to give you a fair account of Robert Alexy's latest move. He opened this round with a paper from last year, where he tried again to explain what he actually means with his notion of principle. And as you might have guessed by now, I will close with a counter-argument against his latest attempt to save his idea of principle. So with this roadmap laid out, and having first assured you that there's nothing personal in our exchange, let me start with the second point, saying what our argument is not about. I do not make an argument against the existence of legal principles. In fact, I'm much more open to legal principles than Robert Alexy is. I think that there are not only many legal principles, but I also think that there are legal principles with many different types of content. I also agree that there can be some principles that have the content of optimization requirements. That is Robert Alexy's claim that principles are always optimization requirements. What I doubt, though, is that all principles have this type of content, and that they form an ontologically different class of norms that has to be distinguished categorically from some supposedly clear-cut rules. I think that there are principles, for example, of equality, of fairness, which have a different content than optimization requirements, and that these principles, as well as optimization requirements, only gradually, in their level of abstractness and importance, are distinct from other more concrete types of norms which the principles theory calls rules. So I think there's only a gradual difference between what the principles theory calls principles and what they call rules. My argument is not directed against the idea of legal principles, but only against the, in my view, misguided way that the principle theories tries to hypostatize principles with a specific but theoretically contingent content into an ontologically distinct type of norms. And thus I side with a gradualist understanding of legal principles that about everybody else in the history of legal theory who has ever thought about legal principles supports, except Dworkin during a short phase of his life and the Alexy school. Further, our disagreement is not about optimization requirements. I, as well as Robert Alexy, think that there can be norms that require the optimization of some opposing values or interests. Why not? My example is an optimization requirement for car tires, which requires the optimization of air pressure concerning road safety on the one side and gas mileage on the other. We do not even disagree that fundamental rights might also be interpreted as optimization requirements. I, and most of my German colleagues, for that matter, think that that is a bad doctrinal idea. However, this is again not the issue of our theoretical disagreement either. It's our doctrinal disagreement. Why I even bother to take issue with Robert Alexy's misguided idea of principles and rules stems from a specific connection between their purported theoretical dichotomy of legal norms and principles and rules and the interpretation of fundamental rights as optimization requirements. In short, their logic runs like this. Principles, as opposed to rules, are norms that do not lend themselves to be readily applied to cases. Fundamental rights are norms that are usually so abstract that they cannot be readily applied to individual cases. Thus, they must be principles, according to the principles theory dichotomy of norms. And moreover, since according to the principles theory, principles have to be interpreted as optimization requirements, it follows from their ontology of legal norms that fundamental rights must be understood as optimization requirements. It is this logic that renders the principles theory dangerous, and it drives me not to let them get away with their theoretical idiosyncrasies. This line of argument does real damage. Not in legal cultures with a strong fundamental rights tradition of their own. Not in the US, where nobody seriously thinks about interpreting constitutional amendments as principles in the sense of the principle theory and optimization requirements. Not in Germany, where the Alexy school is anything but mainstream. And not in Great Britain, which in fear of the principles theory being adopted by the European courts voted for Brexit. However, many Asian and South American legal cultures do not have such strong constitutional and fundamental rights traditions of their own. They are vulnerable to a theory that purports to give them both a doctrinal interpretation of fundamental rights that is so flexible that it allows for almost any kind of political projection, and a norm ontological claim that seems to support it with undefeatable reasons of legal theory they do not understand, but seem to make their allegiance theoretically ironclad. I have two doctoral students from Brazil who work in the federal judiciary, one as a judge and the other as a prosecutor. And, and they both tell me about the real-life effects the principle theory has on their legal system. Judges do not waste any time anymore on deciphering complex social legislation, but revert to the balancing of constitutional principle and decide cases at their personal whim. These are exactly the doctrinal reasons why the principles theory is much criticized in the German doctrinal literature. Not that principle theory aims at such perversions, but it lends itself to them and offers much fewer defenses against them than alternative doctrinal approaches to fundamental rights. Thus, I do not engage with the principles theory because I regard it as such a theoretical, fruitful task, engaging in the negative, of arguing round after round against a theory that I consider misguided anyway, is not my ideal of academic research. It is more like a sense of theoretical duty to break the spell of principle theory by exposing its most fundamental theoretical error. I want to clarify foremost that interpreting fundamental rights as optimization requirements is not forced upon anyone by any theoretical insight, but it is a choice, a hermeneutic choice that every legal culture has to make and is free to make. So now to the center of the debate, the principles theory peculiar notion of legal principle as a categorically distinct legal norm type in the normative dichotomy of rules and principles. Initially, Robert Alexy equated principles in the sense of the principles theory with optimization requirements. And I quote from his theory of constitutional rights: principles are optimization requirements, characterized by the fact that they can be satisfied to varying degrees and that the appropriate degree of satisfaction depends not only on what is factually possible, but also on what is legally possible. By contrast, rules are norms which are always either fulfilled or not. End of quote. However, it did not take long, even for the adherents of the principles theory themselves, to see that in fact optimization requirements present all the features of rules in the sense of the principles theory. Like any other requirement, they can be strictly and completely obeyed by performing the required optimization. To pick up my example of the tire pressure, if truck drivers must optimize the tire pressure of their trucks for the sake of fuel efficiency and safety, truck drivers are strictly obliged to perform the required optimization. And Jan Siegmann, he is with us today here, thus stated that the problem remains that optimization requirements, that's a quote, that the problem remains that the optimization requirements show just the features that are characteristic of rules. That is, strict validity and definite satisfiability. End of quote. The insight that optimization requirements, which Alexy in the beginning equated with principles, are not structurally distinct from other norms, however, is a problem only for the principles theory. By a traditional understanding of principles, which sees only gradual differences between legal principles and other types of norms, the insight would not come as a surprise. It would merely corroborate the traditional view by showing that the traditional understanding of principle also applies to legal principles that can be reconstructed as optimization requirements. For Robert Alexy, however, the discovery that optimization requirements are rules was no reason to revise his view of principles, but, and I quote, only shed an even brighter light on them. End of quote. And ever since, Robert Alexy has maintained that principles are an ideal ought. And ever since, the airy notion of an ideal ought and its relevance for legal systems has been my line of critique. What are we to make of this ideal odd? And what work is it supposed to do besides and beyond optimization requirements? My contention is that there is no need for ideal odds besides optimization requirements, and that Alexy's invention of an ideal odd is just an ad hoc stipulation to save his theory. Optimization requirements is all there is to optimization requirements, and it is all we need. Robert Alexy took his time, but finally reacted to the critique. He tried to elaborate on his notion of ideal odd by placing it inside the optimization requirements, which are, also in his understanding, rules. Optimization requirements are not principles, but according to Alexy, principles do their work within optimization requirements. For Alexy, we should, and I quote, distinguish between requirements to be optimized and optimization requirements. The requirements to be optimized are the objects of balancing. We call them ideal odds or ideals. End of quote. So now, principles are not optimization requirements as such, but rather the ideal odd that forms the object of optimization. Therefore, optimization requirements are a special kind of rule that incorporate a principle. Before I come to a critique of this attempt to save Alexy's unconventional idea of principles from collapsing, let me just take note that the attempt changes the structure of the principles theory ontology of norms significantly. Before, it seemed that there are supposed to be rules on the one side and principles on the other. Now, there are only two different types of rules, namely rules that the principle theory thought of as rules before, and rules that have a specific content, namely an incorporated ideal odd, which is also a principle, but leaves the rule character of the rule untouched that it is incorporated in. Already at the face of it, this theory about two types of rules has lost quite a bit of its initial clarity of the distinction between rules and principles. What started as a seemingly clear distinction between rules and principles turned into something that on the face of it looks rather theoretically stilted. However, stilted or not, that is what principles are supposed to be now for Robert Alexy. Ideal odds which are nested in rules that do not affect their rule character. Does this demotion of the once proud and independent principles to parasitic ideal odds within rules work? Does it make sense to understand principles as requirements to be optimized within optimization requirements? In my duplicate to Robert Alexy's reply, I contended that it does not make sense. The reason is that contrary to Alexy's suggestion, the object of optimization requirements are at least typically not norms, but factual circumstances. One can easily see this, one can easily see why Alexy wanted the object of optimization to be norms. He needs a place for his ideal odd. And whatever we know about the ideal odd, one thing we know, it has to be a normative entity. However, typically, the object of optimization requirements are not norms. To take one of Alexy's examples, the principle to help people in need. According to Alexy, and I quote, the requirement to aid people in need becomes, that's important, the requirement, not the aid, but the requirement to aid people in need becomes the object of optimization. The optimization requirement then takes the following form, and now I can spare you with some logical formulas that Alexy employs. And I've heard it's actually illegal to use non-electronic means of presentation in Estonia, but I do it anyway. So, these are So his idea was that you have O stands for the operator obligation, then you have opt, that is for optimization, and then his idea is what has to, the obligation to optimize another obligation, right, P. That was his contention that that optimization requirements have this logical structure, right? But the simple requirement to optimize aid for people in need does not have this structure. It has a different structure. It just has the structure of O of P, right? And these two obligations, both of them are possible, but they are quite different. Because the reflexive requirement to optimize the requirement to aid people is just a very different one than the requirement to optimize aid. Aid for people in need can be optimized by distributing tents and food supply or what have you. By contrast, the requirement to aid people in need might be optimized by introducing an increasing penalty for omitting the aid or by extending the scope of the respective norm, right? The simple optimization requirement is different from the reflexive requirement. So what we can say is that this holds. And in a paper published last year in German, Robert Alexy conceded that his attempt to clarify the notion of ideal and odd via requirements to be optimized was misguided. And forgive my urge to honor the concession with a quote. Quote, "This has to be corrected. In this point, Poscher's critique is correct." So now we enter the third round. I did not expect Robert Alexy to end our dispute with the concession that in this point Poscher's critique is correct. I did expect him to come up with something else, and he did, even though I think it's not really new. He now wants to defend, and this is his first move in our last round. He wants to defend what he calls an index model of ideal odd, and thus an index model of principles. Alexy now defines two new deontic operators that figure in none of the deontic systems of logic that I know of or ever heard of. But however, that's the fun of doing logic. You can come up with any operator you like as long as it serves the purpose to help formalizing our way of thinking. So fundamentally, there is nothing wrong with inventing new deontic operators. The two operators Alexy invents are, here they are OI, that's why he calls it an index model, and OR. And the index I modifies the standard operator O for obligation for odd into an ideal odd. And the index R modifies the standard operator O for odd into a real odd. Whether the invention of new deontic operators is helpful or superfluous compared to every other so far known deontological system has to be judged by what they stand for and what work they do. As for the real odd, things are straightforward and simple. The real odd just stands for our everyday odd and the odd used in any other deontological system. Things are much less straightforward for the ideal odd. It is supposed to be an odd that abstracts from all opposing reasons an odd for which the principle of non-contradiction is not supposed to hold, since in the deontological systems of ideal odds, an ideal odd of P and an ideal odd of non-P can coexist. So if you want to put this down too, you could say this content is O, P, and right, that is not a contradiction. It's a possible logical expression. That is not a contradiction, right? And I think formally there is nothing that can be held against such a logical system of ideal odds. However, the question is, what work does it do? That cannot be done by optimization requirements, in which the normative operator is just an ordinary, or in Alexy's index terminology, a real odd. The case of contradiction of ideal odds, the possibility of odds with contradictory objects, is handled with the same ease by optimization requirements. A requirement to optimize P and non-P is not a logical contradiction, right? So this is not a contradiction, but also this is not a contradiction. This is not a contradiction neither. What is a logical contradiction? Contradiction as far as you accept in your deontological system contradictions in deontologic logic. That would be something like this. If you had the command O opt P and non O opt P. That would be a contradiction, right? So what the ideal odd does can as well be done without an indexed operator. You don't need them. And Alexy himself does not see this any differently, because he insists, now it comes, on the fundamental equivalence of optimization requirements and ideal odds. So he insists on the following. So he insists on the following, that we, and it's just a quote from his paper, that OR P is logically equivalent to OI, right? And that's just a quote from his latest paper. And he calls this a fundamental equivalence. But logical equivalence means that two logical expressions have the same truth value and under any circumstances. They can be substituted for each other without any consequence. For example, non-P is equivalent to P. P or P is equivalent to P. P or Q is equivalent to Q or P. Sure, we could follow a logical notation that uses the expression non-P to say P, or P to say P. But that does not change that we're just talking about P. And in the same fashion, Alexy can introduce his ideal odd, OI, which is equivalent to the corresponding optimization requirement. But equivalence, and especially fundamental equivalence, means that we can dispense with OI as well and just stick with the optimization requirement. OI does not add anything to our formal logical apparatus, nor to our understanding of norms that could not be expressed in standard deontological systems with a standard non-indexed odd, and in our informal language with optimization requirements. The transformation of optimization requirements into a new deontologic operator might be formally permissible, since there are hardly any limits to the invention of new ingredients to systems of deontic logic, but it proved to be a superfluous addition. Next to this ill-fated formal attempt, Alexy tries another material argument why his notion of ideal odd and principle is necessary. He contends that optimization requirements cannot be understood without recurring to the collision of principles. However, what is there not to understand when confronted with a norm, for example, to optimize black and white in the paint for a room? Sure, it's a strange way to be asked to paint the room in a suitable shade of gray. However, whatever troubles we have understanding the norm, they will only be exacerbated if we are told that it's not the tone black and the tone white that we have to optimize, but the ideal odd of black and the ideal odd of white. And the same holds with the norm on tire pressure. It will only confuse us to be told to optimize the ideal odd of fuel efficiency and the ideal odd of safety. And then it confuses us for much the same reason that I mentioned above. We do not optimize ideal odds of whites and blacks, fuel efficiency or safety, but the things themselves, not any norm or requirement. The command to optimize does not tell us. So let me come to my last point, and that's a little bit speculative. I always ask myself, why are people like Robert Alexy, but also Jan Siegmann, why are they so insisting on them that there must be something special about these optimization requirements? And now I'm doing guesswork. I'm trying to understand what could be driving them. There's one point that might be worth discussing. Because maybe Alexy is up to something here, and he's up to something like this. And again, I'm totally speculating, and there's nothing in his text to suggest this. The command to optimize does not tell us the direction of optimization. By just knowing the mere object of optimization alone, we do not know whether to push in the direction of its minimization or in the direction of its maximization. And maybe the idea is that there has to be something normative about the object of optimization as an ideal odd that tells us whether it must be minimized or maximized relative to the legal and factual possibilities. For example, fuel efficiency, health, or life are connected to an ideal of fuel efficiency, health, or life that tells us that we have to maximize them, not to minimize them. And then we know the direction of the optimization. However, that cannot be true. Since we can easily think of maybe ethically perverted, but theoretically possible norms with the same objects that have the opposite direction of optimization. The US Navy celebrates its new laser cannon employed on warships not only for their precision and firing rate, but also for their cost efficiency, and they sometimes calculate the cost efficiency in cost per kill. And it's probably not too far-fetched to imagine a norm for the US military, for their armed contractors, that obliges them to optimize the cost per kill ratio. The contractors will understand that they have to look for ways to minimize survivors and thus human life and costs at the same time. The direction of optimization requirements is not conveyed by their objects, but by the context of the norm, which reveals its purpose and thus its direction. The direction of optimization requirements is not given by its object. It's not a qualification of the object of optimization, but of the command to optimize. optimization requirements are ambiguous concerning minimization or maximization relative to the legal and factual possibilities, and become disambiguated, like most ambiguities, via context. Optimization requirements could make their direction explicit by demanding either minimization or optimization relative to the legal and factual possibilities, or, if I dare say so, by an index, right? That would be a sensible index. We could have the optimization operator and introduce a min and a max, right? And then you would know the direction by the operator. That, I think, would be a sensible addition to a deontological system that concerns itself with optimization. So even with the help from a friend, there is no way how legal principles in the form of ideal odds are needed or even helpful to understand optimization requirements. On the contrary, the postulation of principles in the form of ideal odds inside optimization requirements still misleads to think that objects of optimization requirements are norms, which Alexy has conceded now they are not. Optimization requirements is all we need to capture everything there is to know about norms that Alexy calls principles. An optimization requirement is a norm like any other that is distinguished not by some kind of norm ontological status within a purported dichotomy of rules and principles, but by its content. The upshot of this deconstruction of the ontological dichotomy of rules and principles is that it is a question of legal interpretation, not of theoretical categorization, whether a norm has an optimization requirement as its content or not. Highly abstract norms, such as fundamental rights, are not optimization requirements by their theoretical nature. Rather, it's a question of legal interpretation and doctrinal construction, whether it is sensible to give them the content of optimization requirements. It is a question of legal doctrine, not of legal theory. There is no theoretical reason to understand the guarantee of human dignity in the German Constitution as a mere optimization requirement, and there are many historical, systematic, and theological arguments against it. On the theoretical side, this is all I wanted to show. The resuscitation of the theoretical phantom of Robert Alexy's principles as ideal odds has failed. Thank you.